So the first thing I want to ask you is about North Korea. And North Korea seems to have hung around like a dark cloud, it seems, for like maybe decades. And the Western world, at least as far as I can tell, doesn't really know what to do with it. Now, Donald Trump has been talking to Kim Jong-un a lot. They've had a few conferences and they're trying to bring China into the mix as well, incorporate maybe things like the US's trade deficit with China into like fixing North Korea. How do you rate Donald Trump's approach to North Korea and trying to create some type of stability or security in the region?
Well, he hasn't done much. It's been, I think, a rather unsuccessful effort he's undertaken. And in some ways, unfortunately, by meeting with Kim twice, I think it is now, once in Singapore, and again, he met him in North Korea, and stepping into North Korea, the first American president to do that, has given the North Korean leader an enormous amount of international legitimacy, almost acceptance, of his leadership and his rule, with almost zero, and you could say less than zero, in return. As President, this was started before President Trump, but we can certainly say that during the 3.5 years of President Trump's presidency, 3 years of his presidency, there has been no reduction in the threat which North Korea poses to the United States. There certainly has been no rollback in the North Korean nuclear program, and if anything, most intelligence analysts would argue that North Korea is in a stronger position, at least militarily speaking, vis-a-vis the United States than it was 3 or 4 years ago. So we have not seen the kind of progress we'd like to see there. We can talk about why that might be or what the problems are. Clearly, it's a big problem. North Korea is a nuclear weapons state, de facto. That's a big issue, obviously, and one that's difficult to negotiate away. I think the president, naively believed that somehow through charm and bluster and maybe getting the Chinese on board, he could turn the screws in a way that would bring Kim to heel. But that's not happening. When you hold nuclear weapons in your hand, when you hold the threat of annihilating South Korea, when you have the Chinese, in a way, happy to see Washington deeper and deeper in this quagmire of discussions with North Korea, that adds up to a fair bit of leverage on North Korea's part, which the United States is always going to have a very hard time dealing with. And so we are where we are today, which is unfortunately, I think, a gradual acceptance, de facto acceptance, of North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. Not a good state of affairs.
What do you think we should do?
Well, it's no easy answer. And of course, this is a problem that President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, and now President Trump have all tried to manage. I think a phased approach, which would state as its long-term aim the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, could work, but that's going to take decades. And it would require some very, very serious diplomacy and, quite frankly, a willingness on the part of the United States to put a lot on the table. Because you have to incentivize the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons. Why would they do that if they believe that the United States ultimately has the aim of destroying it, or undermining it, or removing regime change? All of those, I think you could argue, positive outcomes in some respects, but ones that clearly we can understand why the leadership in Pyongyang doesn't want to accept. So this has been tried before. This is nothing new. Putting incentives on the table, offering up economic assistance, some measures that maybe the president thought he was going to be able to achieve, by offering up some sort of legitimacy and diplomatic recognition, that those sorts of things would, ease the concerns that the North Koreans have about what we're really up to. But it hasn't been enough, and it's going to require decades of trying to instill confidence in the North Korean leaders that we don't actually have their demise in mind, and that we can provide security guarantees of various types to them, which they would ultimately actually believe that we're serious, in return for giving up their nuclear program. Quite honestly, what I think is going to be the best near-term outcome, and by near-term I mean the next 5 to 10 years, at best, would be a kind of, an Israel option, where a kind of bomb in the basement. We know that they have nuclear weapons. Everyone knows they have nuclear weapons. But they take steps to not increase the number of nuclear weapons, to slow their testing program, or even stop their nuclear weapons testing program, stop their nuclear missile program, demate, demonstrably demate weapons from delivery systems. I think they are now, but demonstrate that. In other words, lower the threat which their nuclear weapons pose to the United States and Japan and South Korea, as a way of simply bringing some calm to the situation. And I think that's kind of where we are now. And if we can keep it at that for another 5 or 10 years, then maybe the overall diplomatic and strategic situation will change in a way that we can get to denuclearization down the road. But I'm not optimistic.
Seems like a bit of a quagmire.
Yes.
Now, my understanding is that there's never been a war declared on a country that has nuclear weapons. And so if you're North Korea, it seems like maybe the first way of self-protection is to just have a bunch of nukes aimed at Seoul and Tokyo. And if you have that, it would prevent the US, starting a regime change war like we see in the Middle East or something. We saw China, I believe, in like the 1960s, I think under Chairman Mao, get nukes, as I think they just locked a bunch of nuclear scientists up in a nuclear facility for years and years and said, you'll see your family once you make the nukes. And if you get past the fact that they're kind of a crazy totalitarian kind of insert negative adjective regime there, it seems like very much in their self-interest to build and retain and develop their nuclear capacity. In what world could you show them or demonstrate to them that denuclearization was a safer option for them than developing their nuclear capacity?
It's very, very difficult. They need look no further than what happened to Saddam Hussein, what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. Really brutal and nasty ends of their lives. In part, they would see it, North Korea would see it, in part because they had taken decisions at some point previously not to pursue the nuclear option. So, that lesson alone is pretty powerful to the likes of the leadership in North Korea. So from that perspective, yes, we can say, well, we understand why they might see things that way. On the other hand, you could also make the argument, though, that as long as they have nuclear weapons, North Korea, it's highly unlikely that they are going to achieve the kind of international acceptance, a removal of sanctions, bringing about a larger peaceful environment around their territory, removal of the United States military from South Korea. Even China, I think, is not exactly happy that North Korea has nuclear weapons. They will try to massage the strategic situation with regard to North Korea as best as possible to their advantage, and who can blame them? But it's not a good thing to have a nuclear-armed neighbor. It's just not. And North Korea is unpredictable and all the rest. And as long as North Korea has those weapons, that means the United States is going to be in on that. The Japanese are going to be leaning forward. None of that's good for China. So you can argue that, okay, maybe it's the ultimate guarantor of you and your family's safety. But, it also is going to mean many more decades going forward of impoverishment, sanctions, isolation, etc., etc.
Well, we see China has nukes, and I think Pakistan might have nukes as well. Do you think there's a way to kind of start a process of as like a hypothetical, bringing North Korea like slowly into the international world order in the same way we've seen China do?
Doubtful. China, there's all sorts of international legal and arms control issues at play here that we can say that China had been outside of, has now joined, and by and large has been in good standing in them. Of course, North Korea is it's highly unlikely that North Korea would ever achieve the sort of international integration, international economic weight and importance and diplomatic and all the rest that China has. It'll be difficult to achieve that. I think we may well already be in a kind of de facto acceptance of North Korean nuclear weapons, by international law of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example. We do not accept, legally speaking, that Israel has nuclear weapons, but everyone knows they do. We do not accept that India has nuclear weapons. It's outside of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So is Pakistan. But that doesn't mean that they don't have them, and it doesn't mean that we haven't figured out how to live in a world in which they do. Right? We do. So I think we're moving in that same general direction for North Korea. But in many respects, North Korea is no China, North Korea is no India. North Korea is not even a Pakistan, in the same sort of heft and strategic importance. So while we may end up accepting this situation, I'm not sure it gains a lot for North Korea ultimately in terms of integration and sort of broader acceptance into the international community.
Okay, interesting.